Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our fourth week of PPA 500. I hope you've had a good week so far. The week is almost over. Likewise, our class is going very quickly. And so we are in week number four. A reminder for next week, you have Canvas essay number three that is due next week. And for that Canvas essay, you'll be drawing upon some of the information that we are going to talk about tonight, looking at the differences between public and private organizations to kind of provide a justification for why we have this separate study of public administration, why we have MPA programs instead of just blending them into MBA programs. So the information you need for Canvas essay number three, where you'll be looking at a public versus private organization and looking at a couple of similarities and a couple of differences between those two different types of organizations. That is then due for next Thursday. Then, since we are progressing relatively quickly through our time together, we are up to midterm assessment time. So you have the midterm assessment that is due 2 weeks from tonight. I've made it available on our Canvas site, but I always thought it's good for us to go through the midterm assessment together in class to make sure we were all on the same page with what the assessment is, what's being asked for on the assessment, and kind of my expectations for how you will deal with the questions on the midterm assessment. So I'm sharing out the midterm assessment with you. You should be able to see it on your screen. Just to reiterate something really quickly at the beginning of our discussion here is that this is an assessment. And so it is not an examination. It doesn't require any rote memorization of any of the information. What we're doing with the assessment is that we are assessing your ability to take the information that we have covered in class and to apply it appropriately to five different, somewhat real life public administration scenarios. Most of them are scenarios. There's one, the first one you'll see is not really much of a scenario, but how well can you apply the information to these scenarios? As such, there are no right answers. It's a matter of selecting the answer that you believe is most appropriate for that question and then providing a justification for that answer. Since this is purely an assessment type of assignment, you are not required to do outside research to answer these questions. If you would like to do outside research, that's absolutely fine. Just make sure to cite your sources that you are obtaining, but you are not required to do that. You should be able to answer all of these questions very well using the information that's been presented to you in the class. And so, what we talk about here on Thursday evenings, what is included in the Kettle textbook, what is included in those articles that we're reading from the classics textbook, that's the type of information that you'll be relying upon in order to answer these questions. My expectations in terms of your answers is that your answers will be concise. I am a big believer in parsimony. After all, we are a public administration program, and so we don't do a whole lot of lengthy papers. But instead, what we are looking at is to be as concise as you can be and to communicate the information that you need to communicate using the fewest words possible. So that's just my long-winded way of saying that your answers to each of the questions can be 1 to 2 paragraphs. And I think that certainly would be enough to suffice. So 1 to 2 paragraphs in your answers for each one of these questions. So on this assessment, there are 5 scenarios, and then there are 2 questions related to each scenario. So a grand total of 10 questions on the assessment. So let me walk you through the scenarios and the questions and then answer any general questions you may have about what I am looking for. So the first scenario is not really as much of a scenario as it is more just a description. So as discussed in class, the Constitution received ratification from the requisite number of states relatively quickly. However, New York was slow to ratify. The goal of developing the Bill of Rights and writing the Federalist Papers was to convince the citizens of New York and anti-federalists to support the new Constitution. The work we currently do as public administrators is directly affected by the liberties and freedoms incorporated into the Bill of Rights. So he said that we know that the framers, at least 3 of them, Madison, Hamilton, and Jay, wrote the Federalist Papers, And then also, the framers had to amend the Constitution 10 times immediately through the Bill of Rights. And that was all done to try and ameliorate the concerns of the Anti-Federalists that the new national government would be too strong. The freedoms and liberties that were incorporated in the Bill of Rights are of great import to us as public administrators because if we are to maintain our qualified good faith immunity, we need to understand what those liberties are and the constitutional rights of people that we are dealing with, and then endeavor not to violate those rights. So in question 1A, I ask that you select three freedoms discussed in the Bill of Rights and discuss how these freedoms affect the work of public administrators. Now, these can be any three freedoms from the Bill of Rights. They can be three from the First Amendment if you're very interested in freedom of speech and press and assembly, religion. You could pick three just from the First Amendment, or you can pick three from different amendments. And so you can talk about um, you know, protection from unreasonable search and seizure. You could talk about right to counsel. It's completely up to you, but just pick three freedoms that are incorporated within the Bill of Rights and discuss how those freedoms affect the work that we do as public administrators. So a paragraph or two is certainly enough to suffice then for question 1A. Then in 1B, we turn our attention directly to Federalist number 39. And I walked you through very quickly Federalist 39 in class, written by James Madison. Madison made a compelling argument for the new Constitution in Federalist Paper number 39. Select and discuss three arguments made by Madison in Federalist 39 to convince Anti-Federalists to support the new Constitution. So he made a lot of arguments in Federalist 39. Select three of the arguments that he made and discuss those arguments in terms of how they help to convince Anti-Federalists to support the new Constitution. Again, a paragraph or two should be enough. So that's scenario one and questions 1A and 1B. Each one of the questions on this entire assessment will be worth 10 points. And so 10 questions, 10 points per question gives you a grand total of 100 points on the assessment. Then in scenario number two, we turn our attention to that information we covered when we talked about accountability and ethics in the public service. So the city of South Terra Verde is a quickly growing community adjacent to a large metropolitan area. South Terra Verde has decided to construct a large public park in the center of town to accommodate the recreation needs of its growing population. The city council has been discussing this issue for the past 2 months and plans to discuss the purchase of land for this park again at their next council meeting, with a possible vote on the purchase also scheduled for this meeting. So they have agendized this discussion and a vote for their next meeting. Council member Hayes recently, as of last week, purchased a tract of land within the area for the proposed city park. Councilmember Hayes plans to participate in the discussion and vote on the city's purchase of the land for the park. So he plans to not only participate in the discussion, but also participate in the vote. Question 2A, if Mr. Hayes participates in the discussion and votes on the proposed land purchase, what principles in the ASPA Code of Ethics would this potentially violate and why? So in a previous class, we talked about the 8 principles in the ASPA Code of Ethics. You'll be selecting which of those principles you think would be violated by Mr. Hayes engaging in the discussion and also participating in the vote on that land. And then 2B, just from a more personal standpoint, are you concerned with Mr. Hayes's purchase of the land? Why or why not? So you kind of, from your own personal perspective, what do you think about him purchasing this land to begin with? So those are questions 2A and 2B, both looking at accountability and ethics. Then scenario number 3 gets us at the question of differences between public and private sectors, which is information we are going to cover in class tonight. The Midtown Unified School District has seen its student population increase by 40% over the past 2 years. The growth is forecast to continue for the next 10 years due to development within the district's jurisdiction. Faced with this exponential growth in student population, the district needs to construct new schools quickly. The district decides to construct a school on the east side of the city by funding the school with bonds, which means borrowing money. In our last class session for our semester together, we will talk about managing fiscal resources. And as part of that discussion, we'll talk about borrowing money. But for our purposes right now, just to help you with this scenario, if you've never dealt with it before, this is how governments borrow money in order to pay for capital projects. It's called issuing bonds. So they'll issue a bond, investors will purchase that bond, and then the revenue they get from the investors purchasing the bond, they'll then use that revenue to construct the facility. They then obviously have to pay those bonds back. So it's essentially the same as we do in our everyday lives. You want to buy a car, you borrow, take a loan and borrow money to buy a car. So they're borrowing money in order to construct this school. The construction costs of the school are estimated to be $65 million, and construction should take 18 months. The district also entered into an agreement with a developer to construct another school on the western edge of the city. That school will be completely built by the developer with little to no district interaction. This school will be identical to the school on the east and is estimated to cost $45 million, so significantly less, and take only 12 months to complete, as opposed to the 18 months it will take for the district to complete the school that they are building. So question 3A, what explains the discrepancy in the time to completion and cost between the two schools? And then 3B, what are some of the disadvantages to allowing a private sector developer to construct the school on the west side of the city? So again, you'll draw upon the information that we cover in tonight's class in order to answer 3A and 3B. So by the end of class tonight, you'll have all the information that you need in order to adequately handle scenarios 1, 2, and 3. Scenario 4 then turns our attention to the study of public administration and this whole idea about public administration as a separate field of study. As we know, Woodrow Wilson's classic article, The Study of Administration, formed the basis for a separate field of the study of administration. One of the enduring concepts that emerged from the article was the idea of a politics-administration dichotomy. This Wilson article is one that you have assigned for next week, so we'll discuss the Wilson article next week. 4A, describe Wilson's argument for why we need a separate study of administration. And then 4B, describe the politics administration dichotomy and why this dichotomy is no longer as valid as it once may have been. So that's all information we will cover then next week. Then scenario number 5. The Department of Housing in the city of Tyler Heights is a large, old organization in the state of New Mexico. Its primary function is to make adequate and affordable housing available to income-eligible residents in the city. As an older organization, the Department of Housing has developed an extensive set of policies and procedures. Employees are held accountable and evaluated based upon how closely they adhere to these policies and procedures. Employee turnover is high as employees feel that they are not valued and have few opportunities to develop their skills through training. There is little vertical and horizontal communication occurring in the organization. So here is this older organization, kind of an idea about what it does in terms of its functions, but it also has all these dysfunctions and all these problems going on within the organization. Question 5A, select 2 classical organization theorists or theories that you feel would benefit the organization and discuss why these theories would be beneficial. And then 5B, select 2 neoclassical organization theories that you feel would be beneficial and discuss why those 2 theories would be beneficial. This is information that we are going to cover in the second half of class next week. Next week, I will walk you through about 150 years of development of theoretical perspectives on public administration and how we study public organizations. And so you'll get all the information you need about the classical school and the neoclassical schools of organization theory next week, sufficient to answer questions 5A and 5B. So essentially, you can get started on the midterm as soon as you would like. It's all open book. And you can, right as of right now, be able to answer, well, I say at the end of class tonight, I should say, you'll be able to answer scenarios one, two, and three. At the end of class next week, you'll be able to handle then scenarios four and five. Again, be concise and parsimonious in your answers. 1 to 2 paragraphs per question should be good enough. So that is the midterm assessment. Again, that is due in 2 weeks. So 2 weeks from tonight by midnight. And I'll entertain any questions you have at this point in time or any clarifications needed on the midterm assessment.
When you say a paragraph answer, you mean a paragraph for like question A and question B, right?
Well, I would think a paragraph for question 1A, a paragraph for question 1B. So a paragraph for each one of those.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Thank
Yes, yeah, that's right, Emma. When I say 2 weeks from tonight, it would be midnight on February the 26th. So 11:59 p.m. on February the 26th. Absolutely. And as always, if you work on this and you get it ready ahead of time, you can submit it whenever you want to submit it through Canvas. I tend to evaluate these on a rolling basis. And so I kind of, whenever they come in, it pops up on my Canvas site that I have an ungraded assignment. And then just because of the way in which I am, I typically have to go and grade that assignment as soon as I see it on there. I'm one of those people that whenever you get like on your phone, an update on the phone, there's that little red number showing that there's an update on the phone. I can't stand that. I have to go and clear out that update. And so I tend to grade these things as they come in. Obviously, if you turn it in at like 2 a.m., I'm probably not going to get to it in about 8 a.m. the next morning, but you'll usually get a turnaround relatively quickly. And the way in which I evaluate these is, again, I'm looking at your justification for your answers. So two people can give me two completely different answers, but if they justify those answers and those answers are appropriate, then they will both get full credit. Again, it goes back to my favorite answer to everything. It depends in public administration. It really depends upon the context of the situation. But again, these are assessments. And so I'm just looking at using this as a vehicle to make sure that you have understood the information and you're able to apply that information appropriately in given settings and situations. Whenever I do evaluate these, what I typically do is I use the inline grading function. And so I use the little comment box. And so for each one of your answer, each one of the scenarios, I will use the comment box to either put a comment in there, or if it's a full credit, 20 out of 20 on that scenario, I'll just indicate the score of 20. But if I ever do deduct any points, I will give you the comments right there on the assessment about why I deducted those points. So you get that feedback within the document itself. And then there's a feedback box. So I'll give you your grade out of 100. And then in the feedback box, I'll then give you some general feedback. If there's anything specific that I thought could have been done a little differently, that would have been provided within the assessment itself. And I'll just refer you to the assessment to see those comments. But you'll get comments in two places. One with the comment boxes on the actual assessment itself, and then also a comment in the general feedback box. But I'll never deduct points from any assignment without telling you why those points were deducted. That was always one of those pet peeves of mine when I was in graduate school, and you would get a paper back and you would get an A minus, and that's all that would be on the paper. And there would be no formative feedback. There would be nothing to justify the A minus, and that would absolutely drive me crazy. I had a professor at Ohio State who had gotten his degree at Harvard. He had taught at Harvard for several years before coming to Ohio State, and he told the class on the very first day that he doesn't give A's. The best grade you could hope for is an A minus, regardless of what you do in the class. Because his argument was an A means perfect, and nobody in the world is perfect. He would always tell us, I never gave an A when I taught at Harvard, and I'm certainly not going to give an A here at Ohio State. So, a pet peeve of mine when people do that. So, I will always give you feedback on the assignments that you submit. Okay, so that is the midterm assessment. As you start working on it, if you have any questions, as always, feel free to reach out to me. Just shoot me an email. I'm happy to answer any questions or give you any clarifications that are necessary. So for tonight, our primary focus tonight will be pointing out some of the differences between public versus private administration, all done for the primary purpose of building a justification for why we have this separate study of public administration. And then next week, this will all culminate in you developing your own position about whether or not public administration truly warrants being an academic discipline, or if public administration is merely a subfield in a larger academic discipline like political science. So, what we're doing this week and next week is we're kind of laying the foundation for what is public administration, why we study public administration, and then how we study public administration. So, to start that discussion tonight, we know that public administration is a very large field of study. And it's a large field of study because we encounter public administration everywhere we go on a daily basis. So it doesn't matter if you're talking about the car that you drive to work, that will be regulated by government in terms of safety regulations. The roads that you drive on will probably be paid for by taxpayer dollars, and they're paid for by contracts that are supported by government. The bed that you sleep on will be regulated in terms of safety regulations, the food you eat, the medications that you take, and we could go on and on. So government bureaucracy is really encountered everywhere on a daily basis in almost every single aspect of our daily lives. Since people encounter government bureaucracy so frequently, it really has become a source of a lot of debate. And our goal in studying bureaucracy and public administration is to try and create effective and efficient program implementation while still holding administrators accountable to elected officials. And then those elected officials are held accountable by the people. As we talked about when we talked about accountability and ethics, it's really supposed to be those elected officials that serve as that connective tissue to try and connect those administrators and their actions with the under the purview and the scrutiny of members of the public. And so we are held accountable to elected officials. Elected officials are then, at least in theory, held accountable by the public. So we encounter public administration everywhere, which then makes it something that is certainly worthy of studying. But what really is the study of public administration? What are we really studying when we study public administration? When we study public administration at its very heart, we are studying public bureaucracy. Public bureaucracy refers to public organizations. So when you think about public bureaucracy, we're thinking about public organizations. So the study of public administration really does revolve around the study of these public organizations, which constitute the bureaucracy. So what are these public organizations? Well, a public organization, now I've got a definition there on the screen for you, is a formal, rational system of relationships among persons vested with administrative authority to carry out public programs. That's a pretty nice, basic classroom or a textbook type of definition. But let's go and break that definition down so that we can see what the specific things are that we actually study when we study these public bureaucracies, these public organizations. So first off, we know public organizations are formal. They have a formality to them. If you are currently working in a public organization, I'm sure your organization has that air of formality to it. You probably have an organization chart. That organization chart will then specify all the positions within the organization and how those positions relate to each other. That's a formal organization chart. Your organization probably has a strategic plan. That is a formal pronouncement of the goals and the objectives and the values and the mission of that organization. And since it's written, it gives it that air of formality. You probably have a position description for the position that you occupy. That position description will list the types of tasks that you do on a daily basis and the percentage of time that you spend on those tasks. That written position description adds formality to your understanding of what you are doing on a daily basis. Your position is probably classified in that it is part of a position classification system. And we classify the positions in a public organization for the purpose of then assigning compensation. You probably adhere to policy and procedure manuals. Those manuals add more formality to the organization. So organizations have this air of formality. They also tend to be rational in nature. Whenever we call something rational, we're talking about collecting information, typically empirical information, information that we can measure. And then we base our decisions on that empirical information. So instead of just making decisions based upon how we feel or based upon belief or faith, we're going to make these decisions based upon information that we have gathered and information that we have analyzed. That makes our organizations rational in nature. So they're formal, they're rational systems of relationships among persons. And so with the persons, we're typically talking about primarily administrators who are vested with administrative authority. And this is one of your primary differences between public and private organizations, is that public administrators are vested with administrative authority. That administrative authority comes from elected officials. So it's going to come from a legislative body. So the legislative body creates the organization through enabling legislation. That legislative body then also empowers that organization through that enabling legislation in terms of its duties and its functions and its mission. That legislative body, through legislation, will then also pass their appropriations for that administrative organization. So the money that we get, which is the lifeblood of public organizations, typically will come from appropriations. Now, we know that that's a vexing process, and we're watching it play out right now in the U.S. Senate, in that the Department of Homeland Security was carved out of the last omnibus appropriation bill to fund all the rest of the federal government. So as of midnight, and if something's changed between like noon and 4 o'clock, let me know because I haven't had the news on for the past 4 hours. But as of at least noon today, the Senate was unable to come to an agreement on funding for the Department of Homeland Security. And if they're not able to either come to an agreement on a permanent appropriations bill for DHS or come to an agreement on a continuing resolution to just keep the department going, as of midnight tomorrow, the Department of Homeland Security will no longer have appropriations authority to go out there and spend money. Now, the caveat to all of that is that last spring we had this HR1, a reconciliation bill that goes by the term the one big beautiful whatever the administration calls it. I call it the Reconciliation Act. And that Reconciliation Act funneled a ton of money into DHS. So DHS still has money that they can draw upon from previous appropriation. So it's unlikely that DHS is going to close up their doors and completely go out of business until new appropriation bill is passed. What it does mean is that since they're going to draw on previous appropriations, they're going to have limited money to operate on. And so they're probably going to be able to fund about 90% of their operations, even in the absence of a new appropriation bill. But there's still about 10% of DHS that may have no appropriations in which to operate. That just kind of underscores some of the battles that are being fought in Congress over appropriations that are given to these public organizations. But those appropriations, because they come out of a legal authority, they come out of Congress, they have that type of authority. So we have authority based upon our organizations are created by a legislative body. Our appropriations come from a legislative body. That then vests us as administrators with administrative authority that is oftentimes lacking over in a private organization. And then the purpose of having this administrative authority is to carry out public programs. So we're using this authority to implement public programs. And public programs are different than the types of things being done by the private sector. Public programs obviously have a much broader scope than what a private corporation would be implementing, meant to serve the public interest and society as a whole. And so we kind of have this bigger scope in terms of what we are doing in these public organizations. So we know they're formal, they're rational, they're a system of relationships among administrators who have administrative authority, and they utilize that administrative authority to then carry out public programs. So, with that kind of large definition of public bureaucracy, you can kind of see how all the different elements of the MPA program fit into that definition. So you've got a core course in public budgeting and finance because we're talking about you get these appropriations from a legislative body and then you have to manage and use those appropriations in an efficient and effective manner. We know that we're talking about administrators who are vested with administrative authority, which makes human resource management, PPA 577, an essential course to have in a program like this. 660 organization theory is clearly an essential course because at the end of the day, this is what we are studying, is we are studying public organizations. And then 670 policy and 696 program evaluation, called research methods, but really program evaluation. If we are trying to implement these programs and policies with efficiency and effectiveness, then obviously we have to understand how those policies are created and implemented and how we evaluate those public programs. So I think it's a good all-encompassing type of definition of what a public bureaucracy is, and it really does boil down to a study of all these different aspects of public organizations. The problem with the term bureaucracy is it is a very difficult term for people to like. And oftentimes it really engenders a lot of negative associations. And whenever you ask a member of the public, what do you associate with the word bureaucracy? Almost always it's going to be a negative association. Well, if there's too much red tape, or it's very impersonal, or it's corrupt, or whatever the case may be, a lot of inefficiencies, people will always have very negative views of the bureaucracy. So the contention among a lot of members of the public is that the bureaucracy is too inefficient to accomplish much of anything, but at the same time, the bureaucracy is made up of all too efficient users and abusers of power, which means that members of the public not only tend to have a negative view of the bureaucracy, but they have a negative view of bureaucrats as well. Charles Goodsell, back in 1970, told us that one of the reasons why people tend to have such a negative view of the bureaucracy and the bureaucrats is because that view is being fueled by their last negative interaction with a public organization. They could have 10 interactions with a public organization. None of them are satisfactory. But that one out of 10 interactions, if it is a negative interaction, that will then shape their entire view of the bureaucracy. And people tend to view organizations from this monolithic lens, that they're part of the bureaucracy, and so bureaucracy is bad. That's why Charles Goodsell tells us that we need to, as public administrators, take on what he calls an expository role, where we need to advocate for public organizations. We need to demonstrate to people how public organizations can be effective, how they can be efficient, how important these public organizations and public programs and public policies are to the quality of their everyday lives. One of the articles you read last week, or when we talked about accountability and ethics, the Mark Moore, the Bennington and Moore article, Mark Moore makes the argument that we as public administrators need to demonstrate the added value that we give by being involved in the provision and production of these goods and these services. Because oftentimes when the bureaucracy, when the public sector gets involved in providing or producing a good or service, they are displacing private sector resources that would normally provide and produce that good or service. So whenever we are displacing private resources, the value that we add must be a greater benefit than the value of those private sector resources that are being displaced. So it really places a burden upon us as administrators to really become advocates for the work that we do and for the organizations that we work for. The one big struggle that the field of public administration has always had is this crisis of identity. And the crisis of identity comes from sometimes the inability of our field to distinguish itself from the private sector and to show why public administration is so much different than private administration. If it's not different, and if public and private administration are essentially the same thing, then there's no need to have two different fields of study. There's no need to have an MPA and an MBA type of a program. So it's important for us to understand what those distinctions are between the public and private sectors. And that's something we're going to talk about over the next bit of time. So, just to kind of foreshadow that discussion a little bit, one of the primary differences, as we all know, is this role of public authority. That in the public sector, we as administrators and our organizations have this administrative authority that's bestowed upon us through the legislative process and through this enabling legislation that comes out of legislative bodies. That is something that private sector corporations do not have. Public organizations come into life through this enabling legislation through law. Private corporations can be started up by one individual, an entrepreneur who has this great idea and they want to start their own company. And so it's a much different genesis for the creation of these organizations. We also have different characteristic organizational processes that go on in the public sector as compared to the private sector. In the public sector, we have a different process we use to hire employees. And if you're currently working in the public sector, it may have taken quite some time for you to get your job offer in the public sector. So it's a much more protracted and gradual hiring process in the public as compared to the private sector. In the public sector, we're dealing with career civil servants who have civil service protections. In the private sector, you're dealing with at-will employees who do not have those same types of protections. As we said, from a budgeting perspective, our money comes from appropriations, from legal appropriations. In the private sector, their money comes primarily from profits. Legal appropriations tend to be much more static and much more constant in nature as opposed to profits. Profits can be very dynamic. And if you have a new corporation that enters into the market and they're producing a product that's very similar to your product but at a lower price, you're going to lose market share, which means your profit's going to go down and you're going to have less money to support your organization. In the public sector, appropriations tend to be relatively stable in that the appropriation we get next year will probably look a lot like the appropriation we got last year, with maybe a 2 or 3% increase to keep up with the cost of living adjustment. So, for the most part, we don't have a whole lot of variability in our appropriations. That has impacts upon how public versus private organizations operate and what they value. Since in the private sector, profits are so variable and they're so volatile, you have to really place an emphasis on efficiency. You have to create more output with fewer inputs. In the public sector, if you can count on appropriations to be at least as much as they were last year and probably a little bit of an increase over last year, there's not such an imperative that is placed upon efficiency. And so sometimes we don't worry as much about efficiency in the public sector as in the private sector. And we'll talk more about some of these organizational processes in just a second when we talk about the Graham Allison article. Another way in which we oftentimes distinguish between public and private sector is in terms of the policy formation and policy execution processes. So public policies have to be formulated. They have to be designed and they have to be passed out of a legislative body. Then once they're passed out of the legislative body, as we all know in a good civics type of an approach, they then have to be implemented and executed. The public sector and public administrators and public organizations are involved in both policy formulation as well as execution, whereas the private sector is primarily involved in execution, but much less directly involved in policy formulation. As public administrators, we're involved in policy formulation because we provide advice and guidance to elected officials based upon our technical expertise in a policy area. So that's a direct role that we play in policy formulation. In terms of the private sector, private corporations, if they create political action committees and they make contributions to members of a legislative body, they could have some direct and indirect influence on the resulting policy outcomes, but their influence is not nearly as direct as what a public administrator or a public organization will have. In terms of policy execution, the actual implementation of these policies, clearly that's the primary job of public organizations, is to carry out these public programs and these public policies. But we also rely upon the private sector, especially when we are implementing a type of policy such as a regulatory policy. And when you get into your 670 policy analysis class, you'll talk about different types of policies, distributive versus redistributive versus regulatory policies. A regulatory policy is a policy whereby the government, whatever level of government it is, will be trying to regulate and manage the behavior, oftentimes of private sector entities. And so, if you are regulating the behavior of a private corporation to have a success in terms of regulating their behavior, you need to have their compliance and their acquiescence. So we see a lot of involvement of private sector in terms of the execution of these types of regulatory policies, but not quite as much direct influence in the policy formulation phase. So that's another difference. We're involved in both formulation and execution, whereas the private sector is primarily involved in execution with a much more indirect influence in policy formulation. And another major difference is that here in the public sector, we really do emphasize administrative responsibility. We need to hold administrators responsible and accountable for their actions because they are managing public taxpayer resources. The resources they are managing do not belong to that government. They belong to the people who paid those taxes. So we have to try and manage those resources in an efficient and effective way possible and be held accountable and responsible for our actions far more than our counterparts in the private sector. Another way in which we can look at the differences between public and private organizations is by looking at this piece of federal legislation called the Anti-Deficiency Act. The Anti-Deficiency Act has been around for a very long time, but it really made it back into the headlines in the first Trump administration. The Federal Anti-Deficiency Act forbids government officials from spending on anything that is not explicitly authorized by law. So we in a public organization can only spend appropriations on what we are legally allowed to spend that money on. So we can only spend money on what we are legally allowed to spend the money on. By contrast, private organizations can spend on pretty much anything they want as long as it's not forbidden by law. So ours has to be permitted by law. Private sector can do anything they want as long as it's not forbidden by law. So we operate within much stricter parameters in terms of how we spend our money and how we do our jobs as compared to the private sector. So why did the Anti-Deficiency Act become such a big deal in the first Trump administration? If you remember back in 2017, we had this big piece of legislation called the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. Tax Cuts and Jobs Act in 2017 was a whole-scale revision of the federal income tax system. It changed income tax rates. It took away certain types of deductions. It eliminated exemptions, so you can no longer claim exemptions like you used to be able to do before the 2017 Act. It greatly increased the size of the standard deduction to try and encourage people to file their taxes claiming only the standard deduction as opposed to itemizing their deductions. Because the more deductions you itemize, the more complicated your tax form becomes, and the more work the IRS has to do to go through that tax form and make sure everything's adding up. So they really want to try and encourage people to claim the standard deduction. So a lot of different changes to federal income tax law. Then we had the government shutdown. And so in January 2018, because we could not come to an agreement on appropriations, we had a partial government shutdown. In that partial government shutdown, one of the departments that did not have its appropriations was the Department of Treasury. Well, we all know the IRS is part of the Department of Treasury. So come January, when people are starting to file their taxes, they have a ton of questions about what deductions they're qualifying for. They have all these questions about how the new tax law will affect them. So they get on the phone to the IRS. But because we're in a partial government shutdown, all those IRS employees who used to be in customer service answering those phone calls, they're all furloughed. And so phones are ringing off the hook. And individual taxpayers just simply could not get their questions answered. So you had a lot of complaints that were working their way up to the White House. So the Trump administration decided to try and deal with those complaints. We will just bring all those IRS employees back and we'll pay them. We'll put them back in the job and we'll pay them their salary. Well, it was pointed out that you cannot do that because it's a violation of the Anti-Deficiency Act. Since the IRS did not have an appropriation bill that had been passed, it did not have legal authority to pay those IRS employees. And so if you try and pay those IRS employees, you are then in violation of the Anti-Deficiency Act. And all those complaints from taxpayers really helped to facilitate the end of that government shutdown in early 2018. Now, in the second Trump administration, we have questions again about the Anti-Deficiency Act because we've seen the administration doing a lot of what's called rescissions, where they will take an appropriation bill that has been signed into law and then refuse to spend the money on the legally appropriated way in which that money is supposed to be spent. That's called a rescission. Well, once they would rescind those funds, and they would say, well, we are going to then reallocate this money to our policy preferences and to other agencies or other organizations for other types of policies and programs. Well, if those agencies and those policies and programs had not received a legal appropriation, the question is, does the executive branch have the power in order to do that? There is a piece of legislation that Congress passed in the 1970s, the Congressional Budget and Impoundment Control Act, that places limitations on the ability of the president to do rescissions of funding. So technically, if a president wants to rescind money and refuse to spend the money that's been appropriated by Congress and signed into the law by the president, then the president has to put together a rescissions package, a list of all these different items that are being rescinded, send that rescissions package over to Congress, and then Congress has the ability to approve that rescissions package. That happened last summer when the Trump administration first did these rescissions, sent the rescissions bill over, and Congress approved the rescissions, and so everything was in alignment with federal law. The last set of rescissions, however, the White House has not sent a rescissions package over to Congress. And so Congress hasn't had the ability to review and approve those rescissions. And so now we've got this case going through the courts about whether or not the president has this ability in order to be able to rescind these funds. Yeah, NPR is really good at covering a lot of these topical issues and covering them very, very thoroughly. So I'm not surprised NPR was talking about it. So the Anti-Deficiency Act, even though it's a very old piece of legislation, it really has some true practicality for a lot of things we're going through today. But it's just another good illustration of how limited we are in the public sector as compared to the amount of flexibility that they have in the private sector when it comes to spending money. But I think one of the best ways to compare the public and private sector is to rely upon our good friend Graham Allison in his article. Graham Allison's article is one of my favorite articles because I think he really crystallizes some of these differences between public and private organizations very well. So hopefully you've had a chance to take a look at the Allison article. Can somebody tell me what Allison was telling us? What was the major thesis or the major point that Allison was making in his article?
Public and private organizations act or structured differently.
Mhm.
What
Yeah,
you've been saying.
right. Yeah, that they're structured differently, that there are some significant differences and very important differences between public and private sector organizations. And the way in which he frames it, I think, is really interesting. And the very title of his article kind of gives the argument away. And the title of his article, and I'm going to butcher it, I know, but it's Public and Private Organizations, Are They Fundamentally Alike in All Unimportant Respects? So what he is basically saying is, well, let's look at the similarities and differences between public and private organizations. And he acknowledges there are some similarities between what public organizations do and what private organizations do. There are some similarities there, but those similarities revolve around their basic functions. So essentially, what Allison tells us is that public and private organizations are similar in terms of what they do, their basic functions on a daily basis. So his argument about the similarities between public and private organizations really revolves around this acronym that we'll talk about again when we talk about organization theory, and you may have heard of before, which is POSCORP. POSCORP stands for Planning, Organizing, Staffing, Directing, Coordinating, Reporting, and Budgeting. Yes, I agree. I'm the worst acronym ever, or POSCORP. And so let's look at each one of those functions in turn. So, planning. Every public manager needs to engage in strategic planning with their organization. They need to establish a mission and a vision statement and their goals and how they're going to achieve those goals and put together this strategic plan. All organizations do that regardless of the sector that they are in. However, the difference is in how they do it. So everyone, the what of what they're doing is the same. The difference is in terms of how they go about doing it. So in terms of how they go about strategic planning, how they go about strategic planning is in the public sector, the strategic planning process is oftentimes far more complex with a lot more varied actors and stakeholders involved. So, since we have so many stakeholders involved and they all have different vested interests, it really complicates the strategic planning process. In strategic planning, if you're interested in strategic planning, we have a really good course in the program, PPA 509 Strategic Planning. I taught it many years ago, but haven't taught it in several years since then. But it's a really great class to take you through how you engage in strategic planning in an organization. But as you go through the strategic planning process, one of the most important parts of strategic planning is involving your stakeholders in the process and getting their feedback and getting their input as you identify your goals and your values and your mission and all those good things. But when you're a public organization, you have a lot of stakeholders, you have a lot of constituents. Just think about it from the perspective of our MPA program. And so we go through a strategic planning process and we revisit our strategic plan every couple of years. And our accrediting body, NASPA, requires that we demonstrate that we have gone through this strategic planning process and that we have incorporated all of our relevant stakeholders. So the last time we went through strategic planning, we not only got input from full-time and part-time faculty, but we also got input from students and we created focus groups of students where we sat down with students and asked them what they thought about the program, what they thought the program should focus on, what the values of the program should be. We did the same thing with alums and we sat down with focus groups of our alums. We sat down with our advisory board and talked to them through the strategic planning process. We put together focus groups of community partners and involved them in the strategic planning process. We included college and university administration in the strategic planning process. So we had multiplicity of all these different actors that were involved. Far more actors tend to be involved in public strategic planning as compared to planning in the private sector. So how we do it tends to be a little bit different. Also, one of the problems with strategic planning in the public sector, if you've ever dealt with strategic planning in the public sector, you know that strategic planning is oftentimes subject to a lot of interventions and and a lot of interruptions. It's what we call the fire drills. So you're trying to go through your strategic planning process, and then a crisis emerges. You have to respond to that crisis very, very quickly. Responding to that crisis then takes priority over long-term planning. And so we have a lot more interruptions in our planning process. Our strategic plans in public organizations also tend to be longer in duration than the strategic plans in a private corporation. So our strategic plans are oftentimes going to be 5, 7 years in duration. Doesn't mean you can't go back and change them and alter them, but they're going to usually be longer than how you do it in the private sector. So we all do strategic planning. How we do it is going to be different. The O stands for organizing. And so everyone has to organize work within their organizations. Every leader has to do this, regardless of the sector. But how you organize work in the public sector will be different than the private sector. It's going to be different because everyone has their position description. A lot of these employees are going to be unionized employees, so they are represented by a union, they are part of a bargaining unit. And so when we organize work, we have to make sure that we are making sure people are working within their position descriptions. If we ask someone to do something outside of their position description, that is going to be a problem for us. If we ask someone to do something outside their position description, changing their work conditions, that employee can very quickly and very easily grieve that. So they take that to their union. The union then grieves it. We then probably would have to have a meet and confer with the union. And these can be sometimes very contentious. I've sat through some of these before, where you sit down with management and you try and hammer out these additional duties that are outside the position description. In order to deal with this, you may have to revise the position description. You may have to provide that employee with additional training and then provide them with additional compensation to compensate them for doing these additional types of functions. That would then require a reclassification study of their position. Usually, whenever you provide them with additional compensation for working outside their description, you usually will do that in the form of a memorandum of understanding, an MOU, as opposed to putting it within the contract. When you put something within the contract, you are freezing it for the duration of that contract, whether it be a 3 or 5 year contract. If you can do it through a memorandum of understanding, then that can be a temporary, and it can do a 6 month memorandum of understanding, and then hopefully you'll be able to work out a permanent solution after that. So organizing work in our organizations will be much more difficult and a lot more steps we go through in the public as compared to the private sector. As we know, this terrible acronym then has S for staffing. Staffing is clearly much different in the public versus the private sector. And we could talk all night about the differences in staffing. We will not do that, but just some of the highlights and differences in staffing. Number one, obviously, we are hiring people based upon their merit. We're hiring people who are part of a career civil service system. That means that they have career civil service protections. Overlay on top of those career civil service protections, all of the provisions in the collective bargaining agreement. So we have that overlaid on top of all these civil service regulations. So we are very limited in the way in which we can manage staff in our organizations. Private corporation, those folks are at-will employees, which means they work at the will of the organization. They can be disciplined. They can be dismissed at the will of the organization. As long as it's not discriminatory, they can be fired on the spot if necessary. So you've got a lot more control in the private versus the public sector over your staffing function. How you hire people, and we'll talk about this when we talk about the functions of human resource management in a few weeks or a couple weeks. How you hire people is much different in that we value representative bureaucracy, we value social equity, we value the protection of individual rights. So our hiring processes will be far more protracted and lengthy than what you may have over in the private sector. How you motivate your employees will be much more limited in the public as compared to the private sector. We typically rely upon intrinsic incentives in the public sector, such as appealing to someone's growth needs and their desire for self-actualization, as opposed to being able to give them pay for performance like happens over in the private sector. And again, so on and so on. That's just the very tip of the iceberg in terms of the differences with staffing. Directing. So the D stands for directing. Again, how we direct work, like we talked about with organizing, how we direct work will be different. We have far less ability to directly tell people, do this and expect them to do it. We rely on a lot more persuasion in the public sector as compared to what you're able to do over in the public sector. The C then stands for coordination. Sometimes it is very difficult for us to coordinate work within our organization. And one of the reasons why it is difficult to coordinate work, sorry, I'm typing, coordinate work is because as organizations become older, they become much more fragmented. They become much more complex organizations. So as they grow, they become more complex. You have a lot more units, a lot more divisions, departments within your organization. It's much more difficult for us to coordinate that work across a multiplicity of units, departments, and divisions than it might be in a private sector corporation. Reporting. In order to know how efficient and effective we are as an organization, we need to produce reports. Well, clearly, we are working in the fishbowl in the public sector. So those reports that we are producing must be reports that are available to the public as compared to reports that are produced in the private sector. So we have to do audits. We may have to do financial legal audits. We may have to do performance management based audits. We may have requirements to use outside auditors. Those are all requirements in law of reports that we have to put together that are then subject to the review by the public as compared to what the private sector needs to do. An example is in my district when I was on the board, we had a bond measure. I think I mentioned to you before, $148 million bond measure, and we were then spending that money on capital projects. Well, because we had a bond measure and we got it approved through what was called a Prop 39 bond, which means that we only had to get 55% voter approval for it. That means that we also had to create a citizen oversight committee. The Citizen Oversight Committee then had to conduct audits twice per year on how the money from the bond was being spent to make sure the money from the bond was being spent in accordance with the bond language. So, whatever we have on the ballot in terms of here are all the projects that we are going to fund, we could only fund those projects that were listed in that ballot language. We couldn't fund anything that was not listed on that ballot language. And the Citizen Oversight Committee ensured that all the spending was being done in accordance with that ballot language. And then, as I said, would have to do 2 audits per year. They would do a financial legal audit to make sure the money is being spent the way in which it's supposed to be spent. And then they would do a performance management audit to see what the effects are of how that money is being spent. Are we actually getting these projects completed and getting these projects brought in on time? So much more public and frequent reporting process. And then obviously budgeting, as we talked about before, more reliance on appropriations in the public sector, more reliance on profit over in the private sector. We do have more stability with our appropriations, but our spending is directly tied to those appropriations. So we can only spend on what that money is legally mandated to be spent on. If you're a federal agency and you get into September of the fiscal year, you really start to get pretty jumpy because Congress has never got the budget done on time over the past several years. And so you're always wondering, are we going to have appropriations come at the beginning of the new fiscal year on October 1st? Here in California, we have a much better track record of getting the budget done on time. And we get our budgets done on time and our appropriations passed on time for a couple of reasons. One reason is we have one-party supermajorities. So we have a Democratic supermajority in the Assembly and a Democratic supermajority in the Senate and a Democratic governor. And when you have all three of those being controlled by one party, it obviously makes it easier to come to an agreement on appropriations. But the second thing that's made it easy for us to get the budget done on time, and by on time, I mean it has to be passed by the state legislature on June 15th, so it can be signed by the governor on June 30th for the beginning of the new fiscal year on July 1st. We have a different fiscal year here in California than the feds have. The federal fiscal year runs from October 1st to September 30th. Here in California, ours runs from July 1st to June 30th. But in order to get that budget passed, in the past, you had to get a 2/3 majority in the state legislature to pass the budget. That was part of Proposition 13. Several years ago, we changed that down, moved it down to a simple majority. So you just now need a simple majority to pass a budget. If you got a 2/3 majority controlled by one party, it becomes relatively easy to get that simple majority. So, but if you're reliant upon appropriations at the federal level, you're very nervous once you get to the end of the fiscal year, not knowing whether or not you'll have appropriations approved for the next fiscal year. So, POSCorp, all these functions are done by both public as well as private sector organizations. So, the what is the same, how we do them, that is the primary difference. And I think those how differences, Allison makes the argument, are large enough and profound enough to suggest to us a separate study of public administration. So, to kind of recap, some of the major differences again between public and private organizations are employees. We have career civil servants in the public sector as compared to at will employees in the private sector. Performance measurement. Performance measurement becomes more difficult in the public sector as compared to the private sector. And that relates to the types of goods and services, the outputs that we are creating. Those outputs, those goods and services we create, will then have consequences for those who are consuming them, our beneficiaries. And the consequences of those outputs are outcomes. So the outputs are the actual products that we are creating. The outcomes are the consequences on the lives of our beneficiaries of consuming those products, those goods, and those services. Outputs tend to be relatively easy to measure in the private sector. So if you have economists like to talk about widgets a lot. So you've got your widget factory. The goal of that widget factory is to produce a high quality widget at a price that people will purchase it. So you got to have the right price point as well. That widget is probably relatively easy to measure in terms of quality because you can measure your widgets and you can measure whatever you need to in terms of the size of the widgets and the functionality of the widgets and all that relatively quantitative types of measures you can get pretty readily. In the public sector, a lot of our outcomes and our outputs tend to be much more subjective in nature. So you want to enhance the quality of life of people in the community. Well, yes, we can develop some indicators of quality of life, but one person's indicators of quality of life may look a lot different than another person's indicators of quality of life. So measuring the performance of the organization and enhancing quality of life is going to be much more difficult in the public as compared to in the private sector. Measuring individual employee performance is also more difficult in the public as compared to the private sector. And that's because performance evaluation procedures are going to be very clearly spelled out in the collective bargaining agreement for unionized employees. So we can only evaluate people in accordance with the provisions in the collective bargaining agreement. Public employees tend to be unionized at 3 times the rate of their private sector counterparts. And so you're much more likely to run into unionization in the public as compared to the private sector. So this is a much bigger issue for public as compared to private organizations. We have competing standards, more so in the public as compared to the private sector. We know that we serve the executive, the legislature, the judiciary. We serve national and state governments. Because we have all these different entities that we are serving, all these different entities may impose different standards and expectations on us, and those standards and expectations may conflict with each other. Clearly, we've talked about public scrutiny before and the fishbowl effect. When your decisions are open up to public purview, it means you're going to be much more deliberative in how you make those decisions. It means you're going to create a lot more documentation in making those decisions, have a lot more steps that you will go through. A classic example of this is the competitive bidding process that a lot of public agencies must adhere to. We have a public contract code here in California that is relatively specific. And depending upon the type of government and the size of the project, you may need to employ a competitive bidding process, whereby you put together a request for proposals, you advertise that request for proposals, you then have contractors that will submit sealed bids. Those sealed bids are then opened in a public setting at a predetermined point in time and day, and then you are required under contract code to award the contract to the lowest responsive and responsible bidder. Now, responsive means that the bid must address all of the elements in the request for a proposal. So if we're constructing a $65 million school, and the school is going to be a 2-floor school and have a computer lab, and then the proposal comes in without a computer lab, obviously that proposal, that bid is not going to be responsive to the RFP. So the bids must be responsive, and the bidder also has to be financially responsible, which means that the company, the contractor that submits the bid, they must be registered with the Department of Industrial Relations, the DIR. They must have a DIR number, and all of the subcontractors that that contractor uses must also be registered with the DIR with the number DIR number listed on the bid. They also have to be bonded and insured. We had a situation once where we awarded a bid and then we got a bid protest. One of the contractors protested the awarding of the bid to another contractor, and the basis of the protest was the bid that was awarded. In that bid, they had listed all the DIR numbers for all their subcontractors except for their plumbing subcontractor, and there was no DIR number listed. In the RFP, it required specifically that all subcontractors have DIRs. And so, since that one plumbing subcontractor didn't have a DIR, then we had to review and approve the bid protest and then go out there and rebid the project. So that is something, yeah, rookie mistake. That's true. That is something that you have to be very careful of, and you have to make sure that everything that's in the RFP is included then on the bid. So that is a good, it literally cost them the city contract. Yeah, it certainly did, and it was a pretty big contract too because it was a contract for a new facility, and so it was a multi-million-dollar contract, and so yeah, it can really cost a lot of money just leaving that one number off. But you have to be in accordance with public contract code. So that's just one example of the amount of scrutiny that you are under in carrying out your functions as a public organization. That's something you don't have to worry about. You don't have to worry about competitive bidding necessarily in a private corporation. And there are big implications for that as well, not to belabor this point too much, but if you're a private corporation and you don't have to go through a competitive bidding process, then you can negotiate with the contractor of your choice. And you can then have a lot of leverage over that contractor because they're going to want to have future projects with you as well. So they're going to bend over backwards to make sure that they make you happy on this project so that they can get future projects with you. And you can work with the same contractor if you want for all of your projects if you would like to. I mean, that's what happened then in that renovation of the ice rink in Central Park in New York City, where Donald Trump, long before he was president, came in and was able to get the renovations of the rink done far quicker and under budget than the city was able to, because he didn't have to do competitive bidding. He could negotiate with his contractors. That's something you can't do depending on the project in the public sector. Persuasion, we've already mentioned this one. As a public leader or manager, your power of persuasion becomes very important because you are working within the confines of civil service protections as well as the collective bargaining agreement. So you are very limited in being able to tell someone to do something, tell them to take on another function. So what you then have to do is you have to rely upon your powers of persuasion. And obviously, we've talked about this multiple times and talked about with accountability, the amount of oversight. There's far more oversight that goes on with public organizations as compared to organizations in the private sector. So I think what we have done so far is we are really trying to distinguish why the study of public organizations may be a lot different than the study of private organizations. But whenever you would ask someone off the street and say, well, what's the difference between a private and public organization? They would probably right off the bat say profit. That a private sector organization needs to run a profit. Public sector organizations do not operate to run a profit. There is some great truth to that, but I think there are limitations as well. This whole idea of distinguishing between public and private organizations based upon profit motive alone is what I like to refer to as a necessary but not sufficient condition. Yes, it is necessary to point out that there is a difference in profit motive between the sectors, but that profit motive alone is not sufficient to distinguish between a public versus a private organization. And that's because we do have private non-governmental organizations that are nonprofit and advance a social agenda. A nonprofit organization is not owned by government, so technically it is a private organization. It's non-governmental, but it is nonprofit in nature. On the other side of the coin, we also have some public organizations that do operate to run a profit. You think about something like a government corporation, like the U.S. Postal Service. Even though the Postal Service oftentimes does not run a profit, it has the legal ability to run a profit and to operate as a corporation, even though it is governmental and it is essentially, quote unquote, owned by the public and owned by the government. So profit alone probably is not enough. It is necessary, but it's not sufficient. Well, how else can we distinguish between public and private sector organizations? Another way we can do it, I would argue, is in terms of the types of goods and services that those organizations are producing and providing. So this kind of gets us into if you've had a political economy class or a public sector economics course, you've probably talked about different types of goods and services. This really gets us into this typology of different types of goods and services created by organizations. So there are pure public goods. With a pure public good, we would assume that we would have government provision as well as government production. Now, you've heard me a few times already tonight talk about provision and or production because those are two different terms. So provision, when we talk about the word provision, we are talking about giving the resources in order to make production possible. So we provide the resources to make production possible. So you pay for the production process. That's provision. Production is then the process of actually creating that good or that service. So if you think about an MPA education, the provision for the MPA education, the resources come from your fee dollars that you pay or that your employee pays through an employee reimbursement program, some state subsidies for our state-supported program. So that's kind of the provision. So yeah, Emma, it's a subsidy. So whenever you provide that subsidy, it's a providing of resources. So absolutely. So those state subsidies that we get, not that we get a whole lot from the state compared to what we used to get. I've been here at Cal State Long Beach for 25 years. And when I got here, we always referred to the university as being a state-supported institution. Now we're more likely to refer to it as a state-located institution, just because we don't receive the same types of subsidies, the same type of appropriations that we used to receive. But yeah, those provisions, giving those resources, so that would provide the resources to make this possible, this class possible. Actually sitting here on a Thursday evening talking about these issues, that's the production of an MPA education. So when you actually create it, that's the production. That's a really important distinction because sometimes we have government provision and production like we would have in a pure public good. Sometimes we have private sector provision and production like we would have in a pure private good. And then sometimes we have a mixture where we may have government provision and private sector production. So you think about your classic example of privatization. So whenever you contract out and you contract with a contractor to create a facility, to build a school for you, you are paying as the government, you are paying for that contract. So you are providing the resources, but the actual construction is being done by that private sector entity. So sometimes we have that mix and match. It is theoretically possible to have private sector provision and public sector production. Perhaps one of the best examples of that would be if you have a concert promoter and that concert promoter wants to have security at the concert venue. So they then contract with a local police department to actually come and do the security at the event. The contract is being paid for by the private sector concert promoter, and then the actual safety and the actual security is being done by the local police department, by the public sector. But those examples are much rarer in nature as compared to having government provision and private sector production. So a pure public good is going to usually will expect public production, public provision as well as public production. Pure public goods have two characteristics that set them apart from pure private goods. Pure public goods tend to be non-exhaustible, so you cannot exhaust them, and they're also non-excludable. So you cannot exclude people from partaking in those goods. Sorry, misspelled. Non-excludable. We'll say non-excludable. So they're non-exhaustible and non-excludable. They cannot be used up, and then you cannot charge people for the benefit they get from consuming them. So since you can't charge people, you can't say, well, you pay the charge, you get the benefits. You didn't pay the charge, you don't get the benefits. So the classic example of a pure public good is national defense. Now the qualifier here is I know that the implements that are used in national defense are oftentimes contracted out. So the DoD will enter, or Department of War, or whatever we call it these days, I still call it Department of Defense, will enter into contracts with Northrop Grumman and Boeing and all these other private contractors to produce the actual implements of war. But the idea of national defense as a whole is still considered to be a pure public good because you cannot use it up. So I may have a very big concern about Canada invading, coming down through Washington, Oregon, and invading California. I have this irrational fear of Canadians for whatever reason. So I get a very big benefit out of national defense. You may not share that irrational fear, so you may get less of a benefit from national defense, but the benefit that I get doesn't erode the benefit that you can get. So it's non-exhaustible. And that it's also non-excludable because you can't say, well, you pay for national defense, so you get it. You don't pay for national defense, so you do not get it. So that's a pure public type of good. So it's on one end of the spectrum. Then on the opposite end of the spectrum is a pure private good. With a pure private good, we would expect it to be private organizations that are providing as well as producing that good. So the simple example of my favorite candy bar is a Three Musketeers bar. So that Three Musketeers bar is a pure private good. It is being produced by a private sector company, and the resources that go into paying for that production process will come from that private sector candy company. Now, certainly there are some government regulations in terms of food safety that they have to adhere to, but still it is one of those pure private goods. It is exhaustible and it is excludable. So it's exhaustible because if there's one candy bar on the shelf in the convenience store, we both go in to get that Three Musketeers bar. You are younger and faster than I am, so you get to that candy bar, and you eat it. You've exhausted it. We were rivals for that candy bar, so it's a rivalrous type of relationship. You consume the candy bar, it's not there for me to get a benefit from. So it is exhaustible. And then also with that candy bar, it is excludable in that we charge a price for that candy bar. And if I don't have the money in my pocket to pay for that candy bar, I don't get to purchase and consume that candy bar. It's a good question about waste management and what that would be considered. In the past, waste management was often thought of as being a public good, in that it was something that was done by cities. And so, I'm old enough to remember the big white city-owned trash trucks coming down the street with city employees hanging off the back of those trash trucks to pick up the trash. It was all done by the city and was all paid for through your tax money. So it always used to be thought of as being a pure public type of good. Now we've had a lot of deregulation where cities have now started to enter into contracts with private sector contractors to then do waste disposal. And that's why you have these companies like Waste Management and Burtech that enter into contracts with their city. My city just recently signed a contract with Burtech for many years. I lived in the city for over 20 years. It was always Waste Management. Burtech got the contract moving forward, and so now our waste collection is Burtech. So it's become more kind of that a more private sector in terms of those characteristics. It is excludable because you pay your bill directly to the waste disposal company. If you don't pay your bill, you don't pay the charge, then you don't get waste disposal services. So it really has more of that private sector type of flair these days. But I am old enough to remember when it was purely public and controlled completely by the city. So those are pure private goods. They're on one side of the equation. Pure public goods are on the other side of the equation. In between, though, we have two other types of goods that kind of share elements of public as well as private goods. One of those goods is what's called a toll good. Toll goods you can exclude with a toll good, but you cannot exhaust. So the classic example of a toll good would be a toll road. So with a toll road, you've got the toll gate there. You pull up to the toll gate. If you pay the toll, the arm goes up and you're able to drive on that toll road. Person comes up behind you, they pay the toll, the arm goes up, they can drive. Next person comes up, they don't have the toll, the arm doesn't come up, they're not allowed to drive on the road. They've been excluded. So it is excludable, but it's non-exhaustible because as long as you pay the toll, you can still drive on that road. Now, admittedly, due to congestion, you have to wait for me to get out of your way before you can drive on the road, but everyone can drive on that road as long as they have paid the toll. So toll goods are excludable, but they are not exhaustible. And then the opposite of a toll good is a common pool good. A common pool good is something that should be non-excludable, but it is exhaustible. It can be used up. So you think about something like natural resources. All members of society should, at least in theory, in a normative world, have access to those natural resources. But once those natural resources are used up, they are then gone. So natural resources kind of fit in this category of common pool. There are far fewer common pool types of goods than we have with toll goods, but those four different types of goods are important for distinguishing between sectors because the type of good that's being provided and produced by the organization will help determine is it a public or a private organization. Again, if it's a pure public good, provision and production is probably going to be done by the public sector. If it's a pure private good, provision and production is probably going to be done by the private organization. If it's a toll good, then it's probably going to be done oftentimes through contracting out. And so the contract is being paid for through government sources, so that's government provision, but then the actual production is being done by a private organization. So sometimes we can get some insight into the difference between public and private organizations through knowing what type of good they are providing and producing. And then finally, a difference that we've already alluded to between public and private organizations is in terms of their role in policy formulation and policy execution. So, public and private organizations both have a role to play in the execution of policy, especially with regulatory policy, as we discussed before. But it's really those public organizations that are relatively unique in having such a direct role to play in the formulation process for a public policy. So the question then becomes, how do they then participate? How do public organizations then participate in execution as well as formulation? Well, in terms of execution, the role of public organizations and public administrators is translating a law or a policy into action. So you get laws that are created by elected legislative body, or sometimes executive orders created by a chief executive that will then permit things to happen. It's then up to the administrators to shape those ideas and put those ideas into action to make a reality. This is the civics, 101 lesson of public administration is that we are there to implement and execute these types of policies. So we have a very direct role in policy execution. But we in public organizations also have a role to play in policy formation as well. Before policies are made, as we mentioned before, we have the role of advising policymakers and sharing with them our expertise in terms of that policy. So before the policy is made, we do advice for our elected officials. After the policy has been made, we then have the job of making sense of that policy. We have a rule-making process, and there's an Administrative Procedures Act that dates back to the 1940s that places limitations and rules and regulations on us in terms of how we write these rules to govern the implementation of policies. So we'll be required to, if we're going to propose a rule, we have to then solicit public comment on that rule. There needs to be a period of time that has to intervene before that rule can go into effect. Oftentimes it's a 60-day notice. So we put out notice, we're going to change this rule. We then solicit public comment. We hold public hearings. And then after that time period has expired, that rule can then go into effect. Those are provisions that come to us from this Administrative Procedures Act. So writing those rules and regulations that will govern the implementation of a law or policy, that is, in essence, formulating the policy because we are really making sense of it and we are really coming up with the details in terms of how that policy will actually be implemented. Whenever you have administrators who are involved in policy formation, there are a couple things that occur as a result of that. One thing that occurs is that we have increased technicality of public policies. Whenever you have these administrators who are lending their expertise to the design of a policy, that by definition is going to make that policy a bit more technical in nature. And then, secondly, by having administrators involved in the formation of these policies, you are, in essence, giving more power to the chief executive in policy making because these administrators and these organizations are under the auspices of the executive branch under the chief executive. So the more administrators play a role in policy making, the more the role for the chief executive in creating these policies. So that's kind of your so what question. Well, so administrators are involved in policy formation. Well, so what? Well, that's your so what. We get more technical policies and we have a heightened role for the chief executive in that policy making process. So hopefully over the past hour, hour and a half or so, we have created a basis for really making the argument that there are substantial differences between public versus private organizations. The how that is different, even if the what is somewhat similar. But we do know also that we have some instances where we have goods and services that are jointly produced by public and private organizations. That is this process of privatization. We had a major privatization movement in the 1980s. We essentially have privatized most of the things that are easy to privatize. So if a policy is easy to privatize, we've already probably gotten to it and privatized it. What we are arguing about today is privatizing those goods and services that really have a combination of both public as well as private elements to them. So things such as criminal justice and education, those are the more difficult things that we talk about privatizing. Whenever we privatize and we allow the private sector to have a role, usually in the production of a good or service, we are by definition limiting the scope of government. So this is a way in which we can limit government, is through this process of privatization. So we issue this RFP, and then a private sector company will then put in their bid on that RFP, and then the winning bid will then produce that good or service. And so that's contracting out. Sometimes that's referred to as load shedding. That is a part of privatization. So what I would like for us to do after we get back from our break, because we are overdue for a break tonight, but after we get back from our break, I know we are a very small class, but I still kind of want to do this breakout group exercise. So we're only going to do two groups. We'll do one group of 4 and one group of 3. When we come back from our break, we will break up into two groups, and I'll create those breakout rooms for you when we come back. And then what I'd like for each group to do is to kind of go through this exercise of selecting one general policy area. Again, examples are criminal justice, education, whatever you would like as a group to focus on. But select one policy area and discuss the potential for privatization. And then what we'll do is we'll work in breakout rooms for probably about half an hour or so. We'll then reconvene as a class in the main classroom. And when we reconvene, then we'll have a spokesperson from each group that will then report out with the group's findings in terms of what aspects of that policy are easy to privatize, what aspects of that policy may be more challenging to try and privatize. But we'll worry about this when we get back from our break. So why don't we go ahead and take a break? Take a break until 5:45. We'll come on back at 5:45. I'll create our breakout groups, and then we'll go into our groups and work through this exercise. So I'll see you back here in about 12 minutes. "5:45, so we are back. Let me go ahead and create our rooms. So like I said, we'll just do two rooms because we are a small but mighty group here. So we have room number one, we have four people in, and room number two, we have three. So again, what I want each group to do is to come to an agreement on one policy area, general policy area, and then as a group discuss the potential for privatization of that policy. What aspects would be amenable to privatization, and what are some of the challenges that would be associated with privatization of that policy area? It's also important that each group please select a spokesperson, however you want to do that, because we'll work on this for about half an hour or so. We'll then reconvene. The spokesperson from each group will then share out what the group came up with, and we'll look at commonalities and differences. And I think that will probably be the end of our night because I don't think we'll have time to move on to anything else. So I'll open up the rooms and then you can go into your assigned room. Okay, the rooms are open. Okay, well, it looks like everyone is back. I don't know if my camera's turning on or not, but everybody is back. So let's go ahead and see what the rooms came up with. So we'll start with room number one. That was Emma, Linda Nelson.
We may have been discussing a topic that was not exactly what the prompt was for a little bit.
Okay.
So I'm going to share what we discussed.
Okay.
We chose education and we started describing the ways in which a public education system could benefit from aspects of privatization. That sort of has a through line with the actual prompt that we weren't quite sure of. But we said that they could benefit from increased tuition fees to offer more extensive programs, more money to spend on facilities, and potentially a higher quality education. We said that one of the downfalls would be there might be less equity if they're not required to offer admission in an equitable way other than what public policy requires them to. Um, public entity, education entity could benefit from less rigidity, less bureaucracy. Linda brought up that parking fees at CSULB have to be spent on parking related projects, which we felt was limiting, and that maybe a private organization without, complicated governance.
I don't know if we may have lost you. I think you may have frozen up. Yeah, I think either.
Nelson, you're gonna have to take over my.
Yeah, I think
I
I think
died.
Emma. Oh, are you back,
Oh, there
Emma?
she is. There.
Yeah. When did I die?
You had talked about parking fees and how they had to go to parking projects
Bureaucratic.
and yeah.
Um, And we said one of the benefits was that public organization would be more stable because of the appropriations and not have to deal with like drops in enrollment because of scandal or something like that. Which is maybe not quite the question that you asked, but it was the question that we answered. So be forgiving, please.
Well, thank you very much, Emma. And room number one. Yeah, I think that, education is an interesting one. And I think when you're talking about parking fees, I don't know this for sure because I'm not involved in that, but I'm assuming oftentimes when you have fees that are being charged, that money sometimes goes into either a special revenue or a proprietary type of fund. And that from governmental accounting, there are a lot of limitations associated with those types of specific funds. I know in my district we had a child development fund. It was Fund 63. And so the money that went in there, it was a proprietary fund. And so the money that went into that fund could only be used for maintenance and operations of the enterprise that was generating the money. being the child development, child care fund. And so I think that that may be a similar type of situation going on there. And I think that's a really good example of some of the differences between public and private sector. When it comes to accounting, in the public sector, we usually adhere to modified accrual accounting, and we have to follow, generally accepted accounting principles. In the private sector, you don't have the same oversight from the Government Accounting Standards Board, GASB, and so you do have a lot more flexibility in how money is spent, as opposed to the fund segregation principles you really have to adhere to over in the public sector. And so I think being the privatization could give you a little bit more flexibility, certainly in that regard when it comes to accounting and fund-based accounting. So. Okay, thank you very much. The last class when we did this, all the groups all did prison privatization. So it's nice to have something in education outside of prison privatization. That being said, room two, if you did prison privatization, that's okay. But let's go with
Um,
room two.
no, we're gonna surprise.
Okay, so we picked a policy area. We picked like parks and rec.
Okay.
So and when we were all talking, I was saying to them that I actually work in the Parks and Rec department in the city of Long Beach, but not directly with Parks and Rec. I work in the marine department. So I was telling them like our marine, there's two marinas in Long Beach. So we do kind of support Parks and Recs itself, like not entirely. There is a budget from the city, but our money that we generate from the marina does generate and go to them. So we said like some of the pros of making it private would be like it's like a money saving thing. We said to that maybe if it's private Parks and Rec, it can be like they might be able to listen to their community better. So in for example, the city of Long Beach has 166 parks. And if you live on the west side and there's a program like you want to do a Zumba class, but they don't offer at any of the parks near you, then you'd have to go like on the east end because that's where the bigger parks are and they might offer that class. So if it's more private, then that maybe that person can like get with the community and figure out what classes or like what kind of facilities or what they want to see that make people go out to the parks to make people go out to the parks. We also said like they're going to have private contractors because with the marina itself, we have private contractors that come out and already do landscaping and make it better. So they might be able to find better private contractors that can like do better landscaping, make it look prettier, like just the basic government. They're just going to do basic funds just to like keep the grass cut and like make sure like the facilities are running clean, but like they might not make it look the prettiest. So if you get private contractors, I might make it more engaging for the community to come out to Parks and Rec. They can also host events and stuff like that better and get what the community wants. We said for some negative things, budgeting, we said like there might be more of like a like the public interest maybe isn't as high because they just kind of want to do what the private whoever owns it they could just want to do whatever they want to do. People's jobs can be at more stake because obviously with private your job is you can get fired right away versus a public working for the public sector. There's a lot more steps and stuff involved with it, so there could be just disapproval where they just like I'm just going to do whatever I want and I'll just keep it like maintained to a certain degree. So they might not really have the public's best interest at heart for that, and there could be like cut fundings because they don't really want to spend as much money. Accountability was kind of like what we talked about.
Great, thanks, Lindsay. And room number two. And to pick up on the negative aspects, I think you're right in terms of whenever you do privatize, there's always that question of what happens to the public employees. So the public employees, once you do privatize, do they have an opportunity to work for that private company, or are they just kind of out of work? And privatization is a really touchy subject when it comes to collective bargaining. I know that when I was in grad school, I was working on a project actually it was for the federal government, looking at the impact of certain policies passed by Congress on local school districts. And the one school district that I looked at, they had a provision in their collective bargaining agreement whereby you could not collectively bargain over privatization. So any concerns the union had about privatization, those are things that could not be part of the collective bargaining process and could not become part of the collective bargaining agreement. So they actually had zero protections if the district did want to privatize, cafeteria services or privatize transportation services. Those existing public employees, they were essentially just out of luck in that their union really couldn't do anything about it. And so I think that's a good point on the negative side. I like on the positive side as well the idea that maybe a private company could be a little bit more responsive to the specific types of programs that citizens might want in certain areas of the city, and that in different areas of the city there may be different services and programs that are desired, and then maybe private companies might be a little bit more responsive to that. I do think that we have seen some privatization in terms of, as you mentioned, contracting out for certain aspects of Parks and Rec. And so, I know in my city, they have contracted out for programs. And so summer programs are contracted with a private sector firm to provide those summer programs as opposed to being provided by the city and by city employees. And that really raises, and I'll close it on this, that really raises a very important point that privatization is not a binary dichotomous distinction. It's not that we either privatize or we do not privatize. There are gradations to privatization. And so it's just not an all or nothing type of proposition. And you see that in the education world in terms of, well, privatize transportation services. And a lot of districts have done that. Privatize cafeteria food services. In my district, because we didn't have enough SLPs, speech language pathologists, we had to contract with a private sector company to provide us with SLP consultants because we just couldn't hire them on our own because there were so few of them and we weren't able to afford hiring them. So we had to contract with a private company. Whenever we would construct buildings, we would contract with a project management company that they would come in, they would be separate from the contractor, but they would be there to be on site to manage the construction project because we didn't have enough people in our facilities department with the expertise to be able to go on site every day and manage those projects. So you can have a lot of different gradations of privatization. It's just not an either or type of proposition. Well, thank you very much. I know, like I said, we are a small but mighty group, and so the breakout rooms work a little bit differently in a small group like this, but thank you for everyone participating in that. I think that'll wrap up what we are covering tonight because obviously in 10 minutes we can't really get started on anything new. So just as a reminder, next week what you have due is you have the Canvas essay number 3. And then also next week, what we will get into is we'll get into a discussion of public administration and really start to lay the groundwork for public administration as a field of study or as an academic discipline. And we'll talk a lot about what goes into an academic discipline, what are the characteristics of a discipline, and then does public administration share those characteristics? And then after we provide that, then the second half of class next week, we will walk through the theoretical perspectives on the study of public organizations. And I'll kind of walk you through a very cursory overview of about 150 years of those theories as they apply to the study of public organizations. So next week, we're really going to get into this idea of the discipline of public administration. Okay? Any questions, as always, shoot me an email. Happy to answer those questions. I will go ahead and get this video up on our website, our Canvas site, no later than tomorrow morning. Everyone have a great night. Have an enjoyable weekend, and I'll see you back here next Thursday. So take care, everyone.
Have a good night. Thank you.
Bye.
Take
Thank
care.
you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.